Hello, you're welcome to my platform. I am Dr. Sandra and I am a surgeon. I help you become aware and sensitized about the different surgical conditions. Today's video is about anthrax. Anthrax is a potentially deadly condition that is caused by a bacterium called Bacillus anthracis. Bacillus anthracis, the bacterium that causes anthrax, commonly affects animals that graze on land. For example, cows, goats, sheep, horses, and camels. However, it can be transmitted to human beings, especially when they get into contact with the infected animal or its products. For example, the meat, the skin, the wool, or the hides of the infected animal. Outside the body of a human being and the animals that I laid out earlier, Bacillus anthracis exists in a more resistant form called a spore. A spore is simply the bacterium covered by a shell, safeguarded by a shell, such that it does not die in unfavorable conditions. For example, where there is lack of nutrients, lack of food, or in extremely high temperatures. Transformation into the spore form is a survival strategy for the Bacillus anthracis, such that it does not die in these harsh conditions. The spores cannot reproduce, they cannot multiply, but they can allow the infection to be spread. The spores of Bacillus anthracis can get into our bodies through three major routes. The first one is inoculation, where the spores can enter the body through, for example, a wound or a skin lesion, for example, psoriasis. The second one is through ingestion, where the infection can be transmitted through eating meat of the infected animal, an animal that was infected by Bacillus anthracis. And the third one is through inhalation, where the spores are breathed into the respiratory system. Once in the body, the spores of the Bacillus anthracis are now exposed to the favorable conditions. The conditions within the body are more favorable than the conditions outside the body. So the spores now transform into another form called the vegetative form. Unlike the spore form, the vegetative form has the potential to reproduce, to multiply in large numbers inside the body. The vegetative form of the Bacillus anthracis has a capsule. A capsule is like a shield that surrounds the vegetative form of the Bacillus anthracis, such that it protects it from being destroyed by the cells of the immune system. For example, the macrophages. The immune system, by the way, is the system within our bodies that is responsible for protecting us from invading germs. For example, bacteria, in our context, the Bacillus anthracis. Protected by this shield, the capsule, and unable to be killed or destroyed by the cells of the immune system, the vegetative form of the Bacillus anthracis continues to multiply in large numbers inside the body. The vegetative forms of the Bacillus anthracis will now enter inside the cells of the body. And while there, they'll produce two toxins, two poisons. The first one is called the edema toxin. The edema toxin activates, stimulates one of the enzymes within the body called adenyl cyclase. Once activated or stimulated by the edema toxin, the adenyl cyclase converts a given chemical within the body called ATP to another chemical called cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP causes edema, tissue swelling. The second toxin that is produced by the vegetative forms of the Bacillus anthracis is the lithotoxin. The lithotoxin activates or stimulates a given enzyme within the body called the mitogen activated protein kinase. The mitogen activated protein kinase causes the death of the cells of the body, leading to destruction of the tissues of the body. The edema, that is tissue swelling and tissue death, usually start at the site of entry. For example, if you had a wound on the leg and the spores entered there, that is where the swelling and tissue death will start from. The vegetative forms of the Bacillus anthracis will then be transported to the regional lymph nodes, those lymph nodes that are closer to the site of entry. And while there, they will continue to multiply in large numbers. The bacteria will be transported to the bloodstream, and while there, they will continue to multiply in large numbers, and they'll also continue to produce the toxins, the lethal toxin and the edema toxin, and this will result into the swelling and death of the tissues of other parts of the body, because the bacteria will be transported to those areas of the body via blood, and also the blood will transport the toxins to other parts of the body. The presence of the vegetative forms of the Bacillus anthracis in the bloodstream and also in the tissues will trigger the production of some chemicals called cytokines. These cytokines are produced by the cells of the immune system. And the problem with these cytokines is they cause a reduction in the blood pressure. Once the blood pressure has been reduced, the amount of blood that reaches the organs of the body, especially the vital organs of the body, for example, the brain, the heart, the kidneys, will also reduce. So the cells that make up those organs will die, and the organs will shut down, and then the patients will die. Once the infected individual or the animal dies, the vegetative form of the Bacillus anthracis will now be released into the environment. Once in the environment, the vegetative form of the Bacillus anthracis can now be transformed into a spore form. Remember that the spore form of the Bacillus anthracis can withstand the environment because it is surrounded by a shell. It is literally the vegetative form surrounded by a shell, such that it can withstand the extremely high temperatures and the absence of food, nutrients that is associated with the outside environment, an environment outside of a body of an animal or a human being. The spores of the Bacillus anthracis will now just lie dormant in the outside environment, maybe in the grass, in the dust, in the debris, just waiting to infect any animal or a human being. The type of anthrax that the affected individuals will end up with is dependent on how the spores entered their bodies. The first type of anthrax is the cutaneous anthrax. In cutaneous anthrax, the spores of the Bacillus anthracis usually enter the body through direct inoculation. For example, through a wound or an ulcer or a pre-existing skin condition, for example, eczema and psoriasis, or any of the skin conditions. The first one is the cutaneous anthrax, also known as the Hyde-Potter's disease. The cutaneous anthrax, also known as the Hyde-Potter's disease, is the commonest type of anthrax. The incubation period of the cutaneous anthrax, that is, the duration from the time of exposure to the spores to the appearance of the symptoms, is usually between 3 to 4 days. After the 4 days, a papule will appear at the site of the body where the spores entered the body. A papule, by the way, is a small solid raised bump, a swelling on the skin, and it is usually less than 1 centimeter in diameter. After some time, the papule will become filled up with fluid, and at this point, it will be called a vesicle. The skin overlying the vesicle will eventually open up and it will become an ulcer. There will also be associated swelling and reddening of the skin around the ulcer. After some time, the ulcer will be covered by an eschar. An eschar, by the way, is a painless dead tissue that covers the ulcer, and it is usually black or brown in color. There will also be associated enlargement of the lymph nodes around the affected area, the regional lymph nodes. The second type of anthrax is the gastrointestinal anthrax, also known as the alimentary anthrax. The gastrointestinal anthrax or the alimentary anthrax usually occurs as a result of ingestion, eating of infected meat, the meat of an animal that was infected by Bacillus anthracis, especially if the meat was undercooked or it was raw meat. And sometimes the affected individuals can just ingest or accidentally eat the spores. Maybe the food was contaminated by the spores of the Bacillus anthracis. The gastrointestinal anthrax or the alimentary anthrax usually present with nausea, bloody vomiting, and bloody diarrhea. The third type of anthrax is the respiratory anthrax, also known as the wool-sotter's disease. The respiratory anthrax or the wool-sotter's disease usually occurs as a result of breathing in inhalation of the spores of the Bacillus anthracis. It usually presents as difficulty in breathing, chest pain, general body weakness, fevers, that is an increase in the body temperature, profuse sweating, muscle pains, dry cough, hypoxia. Hypoxia is when the levels of oxygen within the body are less than 90%. The complications of anthrax include toxemia. Toxemia is when there is accumulation of toxins within the bloodstream. Remember that these toxins are produced by the vegetative forms of the Bacillus anthracis, and so they can be transported into the bloodstream to the rest of the body, where they can cause tissue swelling and tissue damage. Other complications include septicemia, septic shock. There can also be pleural effusion. Pleural effusion is when the lungs are covered or are surrounded by fluid. The sheath or the sac that covers the lungs can be filled up with fluid. There can also be ascites. Ascites is when there is accumulation of fluid in the space that houses the intestines, the peritoneal cavity. And some individuals can also end up with meningitis, that is inflammation, irritation of the linings of the brain and the spinal cord. The individuals that are commonly affected by anthrax include the veterinary doctors, the veterinary students, individuals that handle or deal with animal products, for example, hides, skin, and wool. Individuals that eat raw meat or undercooked meat. It can also affect farmers and livestock handlers. It can also affect military members, the soldiers. Remember that the spores of Bacillus anthracis can also be used as bioterrorism. Anthrax can also affect individuals that live or those that travel in areas where anthrax is most prevalent. It can also affect the laboratory technicians and researchers, especially those that deal with the Bacillus anthracis. The investigations that we carry out in anthrax include blood cultures. We can also do the nucleic acid amplification tests, for example, the polymerase chain reaction, PCR, and this looks out for the DNA of the Bacillus anthracis. We usually use samples from the skin lesions, the blood samples, and the cerebrospinal fluid CSF of the infected individual to look out for the DNA of the Bacillus anthracis. We can also employ the antigen detection tests, for example, the enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay ELISA, the direct fluorescence assay. We can also employ staining and microscopy. Here the samples are derived from the airway, for example, the nasopharynx. We can also take off samples from the skin lesions. And then these samples are stained with various stains and they are looked at under the microscopy. We can do gram staining. We can also employ another stain called the India ink. India ink looks out for the vegetative form of the Bacillus anthracis. We can also employ another stain called the malachite green, and this one looks out for the spore form of the Bacillus anthracis. We can also do stool analysis, especially in the gastrointestinal or the alimentary anthrax. We can also do the cerebrospinal fluid analysis, especially in the respiratory anthrax. Patients that have respiratory anthrax tend to get meningitis. That is why we do CSF analysis in patients that have respiratory anthrax. We can also do pleural effusion analysis, especially patients that have respiratory anthrax tend to get accumulation of fluid in the sac that surrounds their lungs. They tend to get pleural effusion. We can also do a chest x-ray and a CT scan of the chest, and here we are looking out for pleural effusion, that is collection of fluid in the sac that lines the lungs. We also look out for widening of the mediastinum, and this is usually as a result of enlargement of the lymph nodes of the mediastinum, especially for patients that have respiratory anthrax. We can also do a lymph node biopsy, especially for patients that have enlarged lymph nodes. When it comes to the treatment of anthrax, the treatment is dependent on the type of anthrax that the individual has and the associated complications. For individuals that have cutaneous anthrax, we employ either ciprofloxacin or doxycycline. For individuals that have the gastrointestinal type, the alimentary type, we employ a combination of two drugs, for example, ciprofloxacin and linezolid. We can also employ the anthrax antitoxin. This usually helps to neutralize the toxins that are produced by the Bacillus anthracis, the lithotoxin and the edema toxin. Individuals that have ascites, that is collection of fluid in the peritoneal cavity, that is the space that houses the intestines and the organs of the body, we do a procedure called paracentesis, where we remove some of the fluid from the peritoneal cavity. This can help the patient to breathe better, because majority of the time there is too much distension of the abdomen that the patient can get difficulties in breathing. So this procedure can help to reduce the fluid such that the discomfort in the patient's abdomen and the difficulties in breathing are relieved. For individuals that have the respiratory type of anthrax and they don't have any other complications, we employ a combination of ciprofloxacin and linezolid. However, if they have any other complications, for example, meningitis, we can use a combination of ciprofloxacin plus linezolid plus a carbapenem, for example, imipenem or meropenem. We can also employ a combination of ciprofloxacin plus rifampicin plus vancomycin. Another combination that has shown to work is a combination of doxycycline plus rifampicin plus vancomycin. We can also employ the anthrax antitoxin, and this usually helps to neutralize the toxins that are produced by the vegetative forms of the Bacillus anthracis, that is the lithotoxin and the edematoxin. For patients that have complications, for example, pleural effusion, that is collection of fluid in the sac that lines the lungs, we can do a chest tube insertion, a thoracostomy. This can help to drain out the fluid from the pleural cavity. When it comes to the prevention of anthrax, the following can be employed. Please vaccinate all animals that graze on land, because these are more prone to getting anthrax. For example, the cows, the goats, the sheep, the donkeys, the camels, and the horses. Certain groups of the general population that are at risk of getting infected by the Bacillus anthracis should also be vaccinated. For example, the veterinary doctors, the veterinary students, the military members or the soldiers, individuals that reside in areas where anthrax is more endemic, where it is more prevalent, where it is most common, and also individuals that travel into those areas should be vaccinated, as well as individuals that handle animals and their products. The animals that die of anthrax should be buried or burnt. They shouldn't be eaten. Sick animals should be identified before slaughter. That is what I had for you. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Please share my videos and also subscribe. See you in my next video. Bye.